I do have with me several different books, so if you give me a question that I'm not able to know off the top of my head, the secret to being able to answer questions is always to be properly prepared. So I have several different books in which I could try and find your answer. Are there any questions? Yes, in the back.
Now, the hand gestures.
Mm-hmm.
After the Our Father, or even during it, some people hold hands, some people don't hold hands. Afterwards, some people shake, some people squeeze, some people kiss. Are they all applicable? Are they all okay?
So, that's a very good question. As far as the posture of the people during the Our Father, there's absolutely nothing mentioned in the general instruction. And so I have to say it is perfectly fine to simply stand there with your hands folded and pray the Our Father. However, there has been a custom developed in this country to extend one's hands, which is called the orans position. And that position is generally taken up by the priest when he prays on behalf of the people. There is nothing horrible or despicable about praying with that posture. And so I'd be hard-pressed to say, you're forbidden from doing it. I use that voice purposely. It simply is something that people are doing, and there's no instruction for them to do anything. What I do find particularly distracting and would discourage, with a nice, pleasant, and friendly voice and smile, but discourage people from doing, is any kind of posture after they finished praying the Our Father. Because when the people finish praying the Our Father, the priest picks up his hands and prays the embolism on behalf of all present. And so it's really not appropriate. I don't mean that in a, like it's a horrible thing. It's just not, it doesn't make much sense. If you know what I'm saying, it doesn't follow that everyone in the congregation would be joining hands or lifting up their hands or doing something, because the priest is the one offering the embolism, and it really doesn't make any sense. There's just no logic at all to the whole lifting up your hands and squeezing when you say the response to the embolism, which I can't think of right now. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours forever and ever. Amen. It's giving an odd emphasis to something that doesn't. I mean, we don't do that when we make all. The Lord be with you. We don't all grab each other's hands and say, and also with you. So it just doesn't. It doesn't fit. It doesn't seem to fit. And so I discourage people certainly from doing that. Again, these are all things that aren't contained in any, never have been contained in any liturgical book. So that would be my answer to that. I can tell you that there's one of the reasons I know some of the miscellaneous nonsense that I know is because priests would call me and ask questions, and at the seminary I was known for having a well-stocked liturgical library, and so to this day I have a priest friend who will call me who has much more knowledge about many things than I do, but he'll call me because he wants to know the straight answer out of the books, kind of thing. And so one of the ways in which I got that knowledge was because people would ask questions about some things they would see older priests doing. Well, not really old. Priests ordained in the 60s and 70s. Let's put it that way. One of those things was wearing your stole over everything else. So the stole is the scarf-like vestment that the priest wears. And then he also wears an alb, which is the white garment he wears. And then he wears the stole over it. And then he wears a chasuble, which is kind of like the poncho that he wears. And so, why are priests, especially these priests ordained in the 60s and 70s, why are they wearing these stoles over their chasubles? And I went and looked, and I have some compendium of different sources. And one of the things I found was that there was an experiment that was approved to use something called an albable. It was a combination of a alb and a chasuble. So a normal alb has sleeves that are kind of tight around the arm, and generally tight around the body. An albable has sleeves that would go halfway to the ground, and was very loose fitting. So when a priest would go like this, it would look like he was wearing a chasuble, an open-armed chasuble. And of course it was all white, so it looked like an alb in certain ways. And there was an allowance made for that priest to wear the stole over the albable. And these albables were allowed to be used when the priest was traveling. We did. Excuse me. I told you that was going to happen. And so that permission for that experiment was given, and actually never formally retracted until the early 2000s with the promulgation of a very interesting instruction from Rome called Redemptionis Sacramentum. This instruction was published just 2 years after the latest general instruction. And what it contains are some norms that start to say, okay, all of the experimentation that was approved across the world in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, even in the early 90s, if it hasn't already been declared an end, it's now an end. It also says that some things that have become common practice and even were allowed by those adaptations of conferences of bishops are now forbidden. Such as, and this is a common one, again, I'm not trying to bring up anything that might be emotional, but I'm sure we'll all experience this. We remember wine being consecrated to the precious blood in large glass flagons or pitchers on the altar. That was a perfectly acceptable practice until this document came out, which forbid it. And also forbid the use of glass chalices and glassware at the altar, as well as earthenware, pottery, even unworthy metals shouldn't be used at the altar. Only metals that are based in silver or gold. Brass is allowed if it's plated in gold, are allowed to be used. And it clarified all of these things and made it clear that certain things are just not allowed. This was difficult for some to accept, and it still is difficult for some to accept, which is understandable. That's one thing I want to encourage everyone to have is, as I talk about those priests in the 60s and 70s, have a great love for them still. Have a great love for all your priests. Please love me when I get done with this talk. Because all of us are imperfect human beings. And if you can think about, and I have this is what that research really brought about in me. You know, when I was the little kid telling Monsignor Judy and Father Till, who were very kind to me, what to do, because I had read the general instruction at the beginning of the book, as if they needed a little kid to tell them what to do, I'm sure. As I read, especially looking at the albal and other circumstances like that, and you start to learn the history, you start to realize things were allowed for experimentation for a short period of time. Newsletters went out to priests telling them to cross out sections of texts inside books. You start realizing, how could you possibly keep up? I mean, I'm only 38. How can I keep up? Much less by the time you reach the age of 50 or 60. Do you want to still be reading the newsletters and figuring out what you're supposed to now uncross out of the book? I'm being figurative. No one ever asked him to uncross anything out of the book. But you get the idea. it becomes very difficult to really know what is proper, what is called for, because it keeps changing. And so we have to have great care for our priests, but we also have to actually take the time and the effort when possible to read the instructions that are available to us, so we know what the church is actually asking of us. And that if it's based in experimentation from the 1960s and 70s, unless it's contained in the current instruction, it's probably no longer appropriate. That was a really... Any other questions before I keep on just talking? I'm sorry.
I got a question. Being a server from a long time ago, the servers were never allowed to touch a chalice.
Correct.
So now they seem like they can. Did something change there? And then my other question is, we had what we call low mass or high mass? 2 candles, 6 candles. Did something change there?
So yes, the answer to both your questions simply is yes. I won't just leave it at that. So now the general instruction asks for ministers to move vessels to different places, and therefore permission is given for them to touch sacred vessels, which you are correct. Before the 1960s, I can't tell you exactly which documents started to change those revisions off the top of my head, but before that, only the priest would touch the sacred vessels. Only the priest would touch the chalice. If a religious sister or an altar boy, an altar server had to, they'd put gloves on first before touching the vessels. This was a sign of respect for the vessels because of their purpose. They had been set aside for the use of the Eucharistic sacrifice. And so no one could touch them except the consecrated hands of a priest. And so that did change. The instructions changed. Now, those vessels are to be carried from one place to another by altar servers as instructed. So that's been a change. Your second question was high mass and low mass. 2 candles, 4 candles. Specifically the candles, that's held by a chapter, I think, on the arrangement of furnishings of the church in the general instruction. You can use, at the choice and discretion of the pastor or the priest, 2 candles are required, 4 candles are allowed, 6 candles can be used, and of course when the diocesan bishop, the actual bishop of the territory, is celebrating Mass, or the metropolitan archbishop within his province is celebrating a pontifical Mass outside of even his own see, a 7th candle can be added to that collection, indicating that is the diocesan bishop who is presiding, or the metropolitan presiding, which he never does, so don't worry about that. But getting back to the high mass and low mass, so low mass was a red mass, not the color, but speaking, R-E-A-D. So it was a mass that was read by the priest, at which one server, maybe 2, but usually one server would serve, and people would quietly be in attendance. And then you had what was commonly known as high mass, which it actually was not a high mass, well, it was called a high mass, but actually what it was a sung low mass, a missa cantata. And at that mass, it was still technically a low mass because it was one priest, but he would have more servers. The epistle and the gospel and many of the texts of the mass would be sung out loud by the priest so that everyone could hear them. That's why it was called a sung, and generally we call it a high mass in English, in our English parlance. Then there was the solemn mass, or what would be called sometimes a solemn high mass, which was rarely done in parish churches, but was done in bigger cities in parish churches, and of course in cathedrals and monasteries throughout the world, where you had a priest, a deacon, and a subdeacon. And that was a solemn high mass. And then